were given with the mercantile idea of payment on delivery of the goods, which could not be executed for want of money to buy the block of marble, unquote. It was precisely a desire to escape, at least temporarily, the mercantile hold on American life that drew so many Americans to Italy, a country they liked to believe was immune from, or at least as yet untouched of modern market forces. Given the distinctly masculine connotation of those forces in antebellum American culture, Italy, conceived as an alternative dimension or a refuge, was particularly appealing to women. It comes as no surprise that when the Italian scene failed to live up to such expectations, the reaction of many 19th century American travelers was one of disappointment. Sedgwick is no exception, as is particularly evident in her dismayed response to the Corso, the main thoroughfare in Rome. Tellingly, what made the Corso so unpleasant to her was that, with its many commercial activities, it reminded closely of America. Quote, "The Corso was full of gay equipages filled with the English people and lined for the most part with mean shops, with mean everyday commodities, such shops, such goods as you would see in the main street of Hudson or in any other second-rate town," unquote. Sedgwick wanted Italy to come as close as possible to the American Republican ideal, but without becoming Americanized in its customs, tastes, and concerns. The same shops that in Hudson or any other small American town would likely have been regarded as a sign of vitality and industriousness, however mean and prosaic they might seem, looked incongruous in Rome. Perhaps more than any other European country, Italy in the 19th century made Americans feel simultaneously superior and inferior. While Sedgwick, after reading Leopardi's invectives against Italy's state of paralysis, felt moved to thank heaven that, quote, her lot was cast in a land where we can think, speak, and act as the Spirit moveth us, unquote. She also realized that she had never been so painfully aware of what was missing in her homeland. Quote, "I cannot convey to you what I have enjoyed and am enjoying from painting, sculpture, and architecture, and when I involuntarily shudder at the idea of leaving all these magnificent and lovely forms, I doubt the wisdom of our New World people coming here to acquire hankerings which cannot be appeased at home. I would advise no American to come to Italy who has not strong domestic affections and close domestic ties, or some absorbing, unworthy pursuit at home. Without these strong bonds to his country, he may feel, when he returns there, as one does who attempts to read a treatise on political economy after being lost in the interest of a captivating romance," unquote. Exposure to Italy's art treasures was enriching, intoxicating, but also perilously addictive. Americans, she warned, could safely enjoy them only if personal attachments and responsibilities kept them firmly tied to the mast of their lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Leonardo, for a wonderful and very articulated presentation that takes us right in the middle of this conference with, combining art and, of course, politics, because the title is a hybrid republicanism. We should keep that in mind. Actually, several of the American travelers to Italy contributed to that, and as we heard, they had, of course, also a strong anti-Catholic sentiment, which was a trademark, actually, of many of the American visitors in those days, and also their relations with the Italian fighters for freedom. It's interesting how this, of course, had to do with a pope who was actually had been praised by Americans initially because of his liberalism, supposedly, when he was elected in 1846. We shouldn't forget that the first time the Americans sent a representative, besides the consuls, of course, to Rome, was because of the election, actually, the election of Pius IX. And I find this very interesting. I wanted to add something, since we are speaking about republicanism. I want to thank also, once again, the Museum of the American Republic of 1849, which we'll be visiting this afternoon, and especially the director, Madame Minasi, because in no time they managed to arrange a visit and open for us the museum tonight, because it closes at lunchtime, actually. So, and Professor Giuseppe Monsagrati will be leading us. He's another colleague and friend here in Rome. Okay, now Professor Melissa Dabakis. Thanks again. She's professor and chair of art history at Kenyon College and teaches American modern European art history, serves as a member of the American Studies faculty, and currently chairs the department. She is the founding director of the Kenyon Rome program. She's the author of several publications, books, and essays, among which I'd like to cite Visualizing Labor in American Sculpture, Monuments, Manliness, and the Work Ethic, published by Cambridge University Press in 1919 the first time, and reissued on the anniversary we talked about yesterday in 2011. And more recently, A Sisterhood of Sculptures, American Artists in 19th Century Rome, Penn State University Press, 2014. In the 2013-14 academic year, she was the Terra Foundation Senior Fellow in American Art at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. And her presentation today is something that falls right into my interest of research: Thomas Nast, Garibaldi, and Emile, the making of an icon in the American press. Thank you.
I think we just advance. No? No, hold on.
Which way is it go? Okay. Okay, thanks everybody. Okay. On November 3rd, 1860, the New York Illustrated News published an image of their special artist, Thomas Nast, in a red shirt, baggy trousers, and cocked hat. Posing as one of Giuseppe Garibaldi's devoted soldiers, known as Emile, Nast joined the general's forces in Palermo, Sicily, on June 21st, 1860. Traveling with the troops, comprised of Italians as well as international volunteers, he made his way across the Straits of Messina to Calabria and northward to Naples. In this studio portrait, engraved from a photograph taken on his 20th birthday, Nast appears as a dashing freedom fighter, brandishing the accoutrements of war, such as a large knife and tucked around his belt there. But his most powerful weapon was his sketchbook. I don't know if you can see it here, it's a little dark, but anyway. His sketchbook, which he sheltered in his lap. He presents himself as an experienced war correspondent who was recording the stunning historical events of the Italian Southern Campaign. Among the first American correspondents to cover wartime events in person, he witnessed battles and insurrections, as well as the more humble events of daily military life. From these sketches, which he made on the spot, he later produced detailed drawings that he sent to illustrated weeklies in New York, London, and Paris. In the mid-1960s, his mythic persona embodied the Italian nationalist cause to a wide audience in Europe, Great Britain, and the United States. As early as 1848, Americans adopted Garibaldi as a hero of their own, a leader who represented and promoted the political ideals of liberalism and republicanism. He was often identified as the Washington of Italy. In 1860, his handsome presence regularly adorned the front pages of popular illustrated presses. The image on the screen appeared on the front page of Harper's Weekly on November 17, 1860, just 1 week after the candidate, Abraham Lincoln, was featured. This juxtaposition of magazine covers not only presaged Lincoln's upcoming election as president, but also the new leader's intense interest in Garibaldi, which we heard about last night, whom he would invite to serve in the Union Army, an offer Garibaldi ultimately declined. Engraved by the American artist Winslow Homer, the portrait of Garibaldi is based on a widely reproduced photograph of an oil painting by Eleuterio Pagliano of 1860. The general is presented with a clean-cut image, his hair and beard nicely coiffed. He wears the Piedmontese military uniform, carefully buttoned and braided, a reminder that Pagliano had fought alongside the Italian hero in both Rome in 1849 and Lombardy a decade later. On the Harper's Weekly cover, the flutter of the Italian flag and the presence of two key lieutenants at his side ensured the portrait's association with the Italian national cause. Nonetheless, Garibaldi could also have been mistaken for a Union general in dress uniform, resembling to a certain extent Major General Ulysses S. Grant. In these Harper's Weekly covers, there appears a doubling of concerns that represented both Italian and American interests. The dignified portrait of Garibaldi brought into consort the political efforts of the two countries, as Don Doyle, Daniele Fiorentino have discussed at length last night and elsewhere. As the Italian peninsula was in the process of uniting into a sovereign nation, by contrast, the United States was splitting apart, leading many Americans to question the failure of their own Republican dreams. In the public imagination, Garibaldi and the Italian nationalist cause kept alive the ideals upon which the American nation had been founded. Italy represented the promise of a new liberal nation, inspired in part, Americans believed, by America's own revolutionary past. And I quote, "If there is one nation more than another that is bound to sympathize with the Italian cause," wrote the New York Herald in November 1859, "it is this nation," meaning the United States. "For we have had to fight the same fight under the same difficulties for political independence." Early in his career, Thomas Nast worked for several different pictorial presses, including the New York Illustrated News and its German edition, the Illustrated London News, as well as Frank Leslie's Illustrated Magazine, and later Harper's Weekly. Distributed on a weekly basis, the New York Illustrated News and the Illustrated London News brought to popular attention Garibaldi's exploits in Italy. These publications delivered international news to the American public in an affordable manner. After 1857, with the transatlantic cable in place, reports from abroad could be sent and received quickly. Knowledge of events in far-off locations became commonplace. Americans grew more cosmopolitan and less provincial. The pictorial press, with its rapid visualization of current events, provided for a new type of journalist, the artist reporter, or special artist, a moniker which Nast proudly accepted as a young correspondent embedded with Garibaldi's troops in southern Italy. Nast began his career as artist correspondent at Frank Leslie's Illustrated magazine in 1856 at the age of 15, cutting his teeth on a type of reporting that could be crude, gritty, and zealous. From the very start, he covered important national stories such as the swill milk scandal in New York City. This image shows Frank Leslie and his team of reporters, oops, I meant to go back. So over here, and his team of reporters, Nast among them, witnessing the dissection of a sick cow. When learning the skills of a muckraker at Leslie's, Nast first realized that visual images could make a political difference. Employed as a staff artist at Leslie's from 1856 to 1859, he provided illustrations of news events and drew other sketches onto wooden blocks, producing engravings for publication. In other words, no clear division separated the artist, engraver, illustrator, and journalist. Several engravers worked on different sections of an image at once, and in many cases added details or altered scenes as they saw fit. A master engraver was charged with the finishing process by creating a coherent and unified image. Unlike written text, which was transmitted via international cables, the illustrations from abroad still had to travel by sea. Commonly, there would be a lag in international reporting between the publication of the written word and the image that accompanied it. Nast left Leslie's in 1859 and went to work for the fledgling New York Illustrated News, where he was immediately sent out on important assignments. On February 15, 1860, he sailed for London to cover the boxing match between England's John Heenan and the American Tom Sayers. The paper struggled financially and did not pay Nast promptly. Consequently, he cultivated a relationship with the Illustrated London News, which had an international circulation throughout the English-speaking world, including the United States. As seen in this image, the London Weekly was well known for its coverage of the events in Rome in 1849. Garibaldi embodied the political ideals of Nast's youth. Having grown up in a vibrant German-American community in New York, he was schooled in the liberal revolutions that had erupted all across Europe in 1848. Garibaldi was a true hero for his role in the Siege of Rome in 1849. For a young reporter, to travel with Garibaldi in 1860 was to witness the essence of European liberalism in action. Reporting on the Southern campaign in Italy for both the New York Illustrated News and the Illustrated London News, Nast arrived in Genoa on May 31st, 1 month after Garibaldi and Emila had departed for Sicily. The general had already won the support of the Sicilian people. The Bourbon government, under the rule of Ferdinand II, had requested an armistice. On the screen is one of the first images that Nast recorded in Genoa, reception of the first news from Garibaldi's landing in Sicily, published in New York on July 14th. It shows a mostly male population. One woman I noticed, if I could point her out, let's see, right here. One woman stands with her back to us. They read broadsides and discuss the current news, albeit confusing and somewhat unreliable at the time. People in Genoa really weren't exactly sure what was happening in Sicily. Men from all classes, including civilians and soldiers, clergy and laity, assembled before the Royal Exchange. A newsboy stands to the center of the image, a symbol of liberalism and freedom of the press, his posture doubled by the adult male behind him, also distributing news reports. By and large, the pictorial presses were proud supporters of the Italian cause. The New York Illustrated News opined, and I quote, "Sicily shall be free, God and Garibaldi for Sicily." With great enthusiasm, Nast set sail for Sicily on June 9th with the second military expedition of 2,500 well-armed men under the command of Colonel Giacomo Medici. They reached the island safely on June 18th. Nast marched 25 miles to Palermo with a contingent of troops led by Captain John W. Peard, an Englishman who had fought with Garibaldi in Rome. Nast's portrait appeared as currently on the screen. It was a grueling overland trek. Nast spent most of his time in Italy with the English volunteers, covering with special attention their battles throughout the campaign. Arriving in Palermo on June 21st, the day after its capture by Garibaldi's forces, Colonel Medici's troops were greeted with celebration and music. Nast produced several sketches of this event. The final published image, The Revolution in Italy, reception of Colonel Medici's volunteers by Garibaldi and his staff at Palermo, from a sketch taken on the spot by our artist Thomas Nast Esquire, now in Palermo, which appeared in the New York Illustrated News on July 28, 1860, is an amalgam of various drawings. Surrounded by his officers, okay, so Garibaldi's over here, okay. Surrounded by his officers, Garibaldi rides into the scene from the far right, doffing his hat at the crowd of volunteers, all of whom hold their swords and rifles in the air, hailing their commander. Even the children wave their arms in support. Garibaldi is erect upon his statuesque horse, in total command of the scene, as he assumed the title of dictator of Sicily. A woman bows down before him, if you can see, it's over here. A woman bows down before his horse with hands raised in adoration, reminiscent of the respect paid to Christ upon his entry to Jerusalem. They stand before the observatory of the Porta Nuova, a wing of the Palazzo Reale, where Garibaldi had recently taken up residence. To be sure, Garibaldi presented himself in Sicily as a popular savior and liberator, an image that Nast was eager to share with his British and American audiences. In another sketch of Garibaldi on horseback, the dashing figure of the general, traditional red scarf draped over his shoulders, hat in hand, the other hand on the reins of his perfectly poised steed. Nast focused upon the general, presenting the background figures in a more sketchy fashion. This scene reveals an important detail. Up here, the flag of Sicily, or possibly the House of Savoy, which is draped from a nearby balcony near waving figures. Added to the final engraving, and I think, oops, go back. I think it's right here. Added to the final engraving, it hung in the background, highlighting Sicily's new liberated status and desire to unite with the nation of Italy. The drawing elided, however, the marked increase in violence and popular disorder that was mounting on the island. The beautifully rendered drawing, the sketch here on the left, must have been particularly meaningful to Nast, as it marks the place where the artist met Garibaldi and purportedly shook his hand. Garibaldi was acutely aware of the importance of publicity for his military campaign. The invasion of Sicily had not been officially sanctioned by King Victor Emmanuel II, nor approved by Cavour, who were both suspicious of the radical Republican government installed on the island. In fact, in early June, the New York Times took a rather moderate position on the Italian question, unsure whether Garibaldi should be considered, and I quote, a hero or a brigand. Using his personal charm and charisma, Garibaldi invited European and American reporters to join his campaign, understanding that the press had become an integral component of modern warfare. By the summer of 1860, Palermo and Naples had become the center of global press attention. The New York Herald had a correspondent in Sicily. Henry Adams, writing for the Boston Courier, was also on site, and Nast, representing both London and New York, became an important part of this publicity machine. In fact, the Illustrated London News had two artist reporters embedded with Garibaldi, Nast and the renowned illustrator Frank Visitelli. Writing on June 8, 1860, the London Times reported that the Italian campaign was, I quote, being fought out under the eyes of newspaper correspondents, tourists, artists, and English and American sympathizers, as well as more official spectators. Once again, Garibaldi had successfully brought international attention to the Italian cause. In Palermo, Garibaldi and his soldiers became quite the rage. It seemed that everyone was wearing red shirts, red skirts, red feathers, red ribbons. Nast sent to New York Garibaldi by the French photographer Gustave Legray, who had famously accompanied the French novelist Alexandre Dumas père to the Mediterranean on his yacht, the Emma. They arrived in Sicily in June, supplying the troops with much-needed arms. Legray's portrait of Garibaldi was engraved and published on the front page of the New York Illustrated News on August 18th. Garibaldi wears his traditional uniform, one hand on his sword, the other resting on his hip. Rather than seeming a brigand or a pirate, he is presented with groomed features, combed hair, steady appearance, making him a national leader. The New York Illustrated News declared, and I quote, "We have this week the pleasure of presenting an engraved, remarkably fine portrait of Garibaldi, the champion of Italian liberties. It is the most admirable likeness of the friend of liberty ever published." It is clear that Garibaldi had won the publicity war. His persona had become a beacon of Italian liberty and unification in the United States and Europe. Garibaldi's success in Sicily transformed the political landscape of Italy. In late August, he crossed the Straits of Messina and landed in Calabria. King Victor Emmanuel and Cavour watched events as they quickly unfolded on the mainland, eventually aiding his military foray at Volturno. Nast accompanied the general as he traveled northwards to Naples. Writing from Monteleone on August 28th, Nast complained, "I have not time to write. General Garibaldi makes me work hard to keep up with him. He travels all day and half the night, so I have not time to do my things." Indeed, Garibaldi's entire entourage of international reporters struggled to keep up with his charging forces. On September 7th, he arrived in Naples by train and was met with thousands of waving supporters, shouting "Viva Garibaldi, Viva Vittorio Emanuele, Viva Italia." Nast arrived the following day, describing the scene as one that I shall never forget. Garibaldi knew his optics well and invited Nast to accompany him to the Shrine of the Virgin in Piedigrotta, just outside the city. Co-opting a royal ritual, he personally attended the festa established by Carlo III to commemorate the expulsion of the Austrians by the Spaniards in 1774. As Garibaldi approached the shrine, the new National Guard, the Italian National Guard, ceremoniously lined the streets under arms. While regularly winning the loyalty of local clergy throughout the South, he adapted religious imagery for his own purposes. As one eyewitness reported, and I quote, "Garibaldi is a saint for the common people. It is God who has sent him to save the country." Adopted by the Italians as a savior, Garibaldi played the role with great success. This image was reproduced first in the London Illustrated News on September 29th, then in New York on October 26th, and garnered much visibility throughout the English-speaking press. In September and October of 1860, Nast covered the Battle of the Volturno, a series of fierce military clashes that took place between Garibaldi's volunteers and the Bourbons. These battles that occurred outside of Naples were among the most ferocious of the Southern campaign. A direct war coverage such as this was a new phenomenon, first reported in the British press during the Crimean War. First, Nast was positioned in the little village of Sant'Angelo near Capua, the Neapolitan military center of operations. He witnessed a battle that raged for 10 hours. With the King of Sicily and his forces in retreat in Gaeta, the Neapolitans vastly outnumbered the volunteers, 50,000 to 20,000. Nast climbed a hill near Santa Maria, from which he gained a panoramic view of the fighting, as we see in the Battle of Volturno, the fight in the field near Sant'Angelo, published in the Illustrated London News on October 20th, 1860. He made several sketches on the spot, but when the fighting was over, the artist's work really began. He returned to Naples each evening and spent hours producing follow-up drawings. Embedded with the English battalions, Nast was particularly familiar with their wartime experiences. In his image, the English volunteers under fire for the first time, bayonet charge of Colonel Dowling's regiment on the Neapolitans, Monday, October 1st, near Capua, published in the New York Illustrated News. The British volunteers fought valiantly as they charged into battle. From his perch upon the hill, he was unable to see the details of battle clearly. Ness probably interviewed the fighters to learn of drawing of soldiers shot mid-stride and foreground. The battery along the road from Capua recorded from eyewitness accounts. In the quickly executed drawing, dated October 6, 1860, sketch of the battery which the Neapolitans took from the Garibaldini, and at this place they burned the Garibaldian wounded and dead on Monday, October 1st. Neapolitan soldiers stand before a pile of dead and dying Garibaldians, smoke rising from the left after having lit the fire. Another soldier bayonets a wounded Garibaldian, attempting to escape his miserable demise. To the right, several more soldiers patrol the pile of bodies, one pointing a revolver at a wounded Garibaldian attempting a funeral pyre. The Neapolitan soldiers are rendered with precision from their uniforms to their weapons. Two wounded soldiers are depicted in excruciating detail as they meet their fate at the tips of Neapolitan bayonets. Known for its more sensational imagery, the New York Illustrated News published grisly views of the war carnage on a regular basis. The Illustrated London News published a different version of Nass' drawing. The British publication attracted a respectable middle-class audience whose taste was more genteel. Battery, where the Neapolitans burned the wounded Garibaldians, which appeared on October 20th, 1860, was coupled with the engraving, Fight in the Field near Sant'Angelo. Both lack the immediacy and emotional charge of the illustrations published in New York, distracting the viewer's attention by a myriad of ancillary figures populating the scene. The British image does not focus on the horror of the wounded soldiers in the funeral pyre there. Only one Garibaldian who appears dead is carried toward the inferno. Both images present a much more decorous version of war. The city of Capua was the last to fall in the Battle of Volturno. In the engraving, Garibaldi at the advance posts before the fortress of Capua, Nass documented the general commanding the newly arrived British Legion, otherwise called Garibaldi's excursionists, who skirmished before Sant'Angelo. In this image, Garibaldi performs his last military act of the Southern campaign. Seated to the center of the scene, his telescope at rest, he gazes relentlessly toward the battle at Capua, the domes of the city visible in the distance. Draped in a long cape, which augments his girth, he dominates the scene. His two lead generals, Elbe and Medici, stand behind him. His troops surround him. I'm sorry for these drawings. They're very difficult to reproduce. In the original drawing, Garibaldi at Capua, sketched on October 19th, 1860, Nast identifies the geographical terrain, the individual actors, and the military landmarks, presenting the most accurate recording of the event possible. The image was reproduced not only in the New York Illustrated News and its German language edition, but also in the Illustrated London News and in Le Monde Illustre. The general ended his military mission on October 26th when King Victor Emmanuel met him at Teano in northern Campania and took command of the troops. The transfer of power went smoothly, despite fears that Garibaldi's popularity would eclipse the king's leadership. Frank Visitelli of the London Illustrated News produced an image, The War in Naples, Victor Emmanuel giving commands to commence the bombardment of Capua, here on the left. Situated atop a hill on November 1st, the king watched as his soldiers defeated the Neapolitans in this two-day struggle. Although the ultimate victory of the Battle of Volturno belonged to the King of Italy, Visitelli's image is far from iconic. Standing amidst a cadre of his soldiers, the king's presence is almost eclipsed by the myriad of figures who surround him. By contrast, Nast highlighted Garibaldi's epic persona, seated as if enthroned and protected by his stalwart troops. Even in retirement, Garibaldi continued to cultivate his mystique as Cincinnatus, Washington, when he departed Naples on November 9th without ceremony and relinquished his military power for the quiet of agrarian life on Caprera. An international freedom fighter for whom national borders did not seem to matter, Garibaldi attracted a large cadre of writers, journalists, and artists who helped create his mythic persona. Nast was an important part of this international network, what Lucy Ryle calls, and I quote, a press-led Garibaldi mania. Nast departed Italy on November 30th, exhausted by his wartime experiences. Among the first American reporters to witness battle firsthand, he was prepared for his next important assignment, illustrating scenes from the American Civil War for Harper's Weekly. Throughout his long and notable career as a political cartoonist, Nast never forgot his days in Italy. He created a moving memorial to Garibaldi for Harper's Weekly shortly after his death in 1882, and painted a large-scale portrait of the general in 1900, which is buried in the Columbia University archives, which Paul and I saw a few years ago. This large-scale portrait of the general in 1900 from sketches that he made in Italy nearly a half-century earlier. In both images, Nast immortalized the iconic figure of Garibaldi, made famous in the Southern Campaign of 1860, a romantic figure who continued to haunt the American imagination throughout the 19th century. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Melissa, for this wonderful presentation on Nast and Garibaldi. Actually, this matches with Don's speech last night about Lincoln. So we have the two transnational heroes matched now in this struggle for republicanism, what Maurizio Isabella calls the International of Republicanism. It was actually experienced by Nast himself, and I was noticing also, along with, of course, republicanism, the Republican ideal, the modern approach, iconographic approach to war. There is here also a connection between the campaign and the brutal, the carnage that you were showing and what we then would be seen in the Civil War. First through painting and later through photography, which was, the major change and turn at that time. So, we are going to hold questions, I'm told. Okay. We are ready for that, always. But, okay. Oh, so questions at the very end. Wonderful.